Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 28th chapter in the first book of Chronicles. Herein, we have read of Solomon's coronation, and we are about to read his commission. So, the 28th chapter is a very public occasion. Everyone who's anybody in the kingdom, from the north to the south and the east to the west, are summoned and gathered in unison in Jerusalem to hear David publicly declare his son Solomon his successor. Now, in the king's account, there is a power struggle. His elder brother Adoniah, elder half brother, who was the younger full brother of Absalom, who himself tried to usurp the throne from David, tries to usurp it from Solomon in the king's account. And the reason that is given in that one is that because David was infirm and he was lax in disciplining his sons, he loved them to a fault, but Solomon was his declared intender, but he did not make it exactly clear. In the Chronicles accounts, he makes it abundantly clear. So, I hate to say it, but one of these cannot be correct, and we believe that the king's account is the more historical accuracy. So even if this is a historically accurate version, so even this is a fictional account, there is truth conveyed, profound truth in Solomon's parting words to his son, which we're going to cover in the lesson itself. But before that, verse 2, then King David rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of Yahweh and for the footstool of our Elohim, and had made preparations to build it." King David is addressing his brothers and people. These are everyone who's anyone, the leaders, the rulers, the Levites, the priests across Israel. And what he's telling them is that it was his heart's desire, his deepest desire, his greatest longing was to be the one who built the temple for Yahweh, and then the bring some rest to the Ark of Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant had a restless existence prior to David's bringing it to Jerusalem, and the purpose that it was brought there was ultimately to build a temple, to house it, and to give it rest from the hands of the Philistines and all these other enemies who had taken it from the property and possession of the Israelites. And on that covenant rest, the two stone tablets that were written by the fingerprints directly of Yahweh himself to Moses. But he also calls the temple a footstool, and the earth, is the dirtiest part in the ancient world. That's why the servants washed feet. And because the Messiah embodied the paradox of servant leadership, he washed his disciples' feet, because the feet is where all the filth accumulates, because it's the dirty. And in the heavens and the earth is very much the dirt, the footstool where he lays it. But David was not deigned permission, but he did all that he could to build it without actually building. He made preparations and plans for it, of which we're going to read in greater detail in the passage we actually cover. But Elohim said to me, "You do not build a house for my name, because you have been a man of battle and have shed blood." So this reason, this explanation is not given in the 17th chapter of Samuel, where David's expressed urge is first recorded. He tells it to his prophet Nathan, but he's just saying that he is not the one to build it. He would have a son for him. We're going to read in that eventually. Because the reason why, now he is not given an explanation after presenting his plans to Nathan, but he is given a promise, a dynasty in perpetuity, and also a son who would be the one to build. So David had this invisible hope of a temple he could not see, and he had the promise that would be built, and also a dynasty in perpetuity. It was from his loins sprang the Messiah, who hails from eternity and rules eternally. But in the king's account, I think the 5th chapter, 3rd verse, the reason Solomon gives that David was not able to do this is because he was distracted by war. Now, the utilitarian demands of defending a nation would have distracted one from the full concentration, the uninterrupted concentration that the building of the temple would demand, and that had to come in a time of peace. And we read in the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes, Part B, a time for peace and a time for war. And David's reign was providentially designed for a time of war, and Solomon was destined to rule and reign in peace. And even earlier in Ecclesiastes, we read a time to build and a time to tear down. War is about killing people and breaking things. It's a destructive activity. But peace is the climate which is conducive to building and constructive purposes. But the chronicler's emphasis is not is priestly, so the amount of blood that he had shed, in a sense, ceremonially defiled him and therefore disqualified him. So both of these reasons are correct. Verse 5, "And all of my sons, for Yahweh has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the reign of Yahweh over Israel." David had many sons because he had many wives. Polygamy was the common practice, the standard practice of ancient Oriental monarchs. But of all the sons and all his women is the son of Bathsheba, who he perhaps, had the strongest physical attraction to. Certainly, he conceived the son that was a stillborn before Solomon. The same womb that out of came Solomon came a stillborn baby in the 12th chapter of Samuel. But Solomon was the one who was special, he was wise, and he was the most qualified. And the practice would have been for the kings to elevate the eldest born son of their favorite wife. But here the selection is entirely Yahweh's. He has chosen my son, not David. So David did consent and agree and not resist, but the selection and the initiative and the authority belonged to him. And so he was doing Yahweh's bidding in promoting his son and publicly declaring him a successor, though we never know it by reading the king's account. "And he said to me, Solomon, your son is the one to build my house and my courtyards, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I myself am a father to him." So the purpose of his reign, his entire reason for reigning and existing, was to be the one to build the temple, and he had the opportunity to do so, and he asked for the wisdom, and he was given, showered wisdom in abundance. So he actually completed the task, the temple task, at the 30-year mark in his life. That's when David finally ascended to the throne in Hebron, and only 7 years later in Jerusalem. But this purpose now, when we did this earlier, we fully intended to make it all the way through to the 21st verse, but the density and the details prevented that. So we closed it up at the 9th chapter. If we could do it again, we would maybe know that the 9th verse signalizes a different direction of addressee. He's telling his son publicly, serve him with a perfect heart and with a pleasing life, for Yahweh searches all the hearts and understands all the intents and thoughts. If you do seek him, he is found by you, but if you forsake him, he rejects you forever. So this advice is wholehearted commitment, wholehearted devotion, all the faculties and all their capacities. Render your heart perfect, stay away from sin, and don't pollute it with anything that is displeasing. So, you have to live a life that is pleasing and approved by the one, the all-seeing, eye-knowing, and eye in the sky, the one who has subterranean insight into the thoughts and motivations and intents of the hearts. He sees all, he knows all. But we have the promise and assurance that if we knock, it will be open. If we seek him, he will be found. He is as close as the mention of his name, and he is never more than a prayer away. But if we forsake him, if we succumb to apostasy, we will be rejected forever. And the consequences for deviating from a saving knowledge of the truth, as opposed to dying in your sins and ignorance, are even more devastating and severe. 10th verse, lesson itself. Now this connects to the last verse we read in the 6th verse. We originally intended to connect it, but remember that he is designated the son and successor and appointed the task to be the one to build the temple. See now, for Yahweh has chosen you to build a house for the temple. Be strong and do it. He reminds him of his select purpose. He is elected for this task. He is chosen by the sovereign decree of the Almighty Yahweh, and he's the one who is going to build him a house, and it's going to be a temple. That is where his presence is theoretically housed. But as Solomon acknowledges after dedicating the temple, that it is incomprehensible that human beings can contain God in a building of 4 walls when he created the heavens and the cosmos and everything else. 1 Kings 8:27, 2 Chronicles 2:6. But this task demanded strength, it demanded wisdom, it demanded, ingenuity, and he had the strength that he needed because knocking it shall be opened, asking you shall find, and asking you shall receive, seeking you shall be found. So his source of strength, he would find it in Yahweh, who planned the task and enabled him to do it. And David gave his son Solomon the plans for the porch and its houses and its treasuries and its upper rooms and its inner rooms and the place of atonement. The temple was a multi-building complex. There was all these things that were necessary. The porch, that would have been the welcoming pad, the exterior, the houses. There would have been houses for the Levites and the priests and everyone else. Treasury, where to store the temple treasury, the donations. And I think that there were about 13 vestibules by Herod's design in the court of the women, where one could drop their coin collections in. But there would have been upper rooms above. These would have been multi-floor rooms and inner rooms, and just all this elaborate, ornate architecture. And the place for atonement, that is the animal sacrifice. The innocent animal is sacrificed for the sake of the procurement of the forgiveness of the guilty sinner. And plans for all that he had by the Ruah, by the Spirit, of the courtyards of the house of Yahweh, and all the rooms all around, and all the treasuries of the house of Elohim, and of the treasuries for the sacred gifts. So the plan, he extends this thought more fully in the 19th verse. He claims to be a recipient of a direct revelation for the designing of the temple, and there are 3 other individuals who can enjoy that claim. Moses on the wilderness, the 40-day fast in Exodus 25 through 31, he is receiving the revelations for the blueprint of the tabernacle. David was similarly visited here, and the prophet Ezekiel receives the designs and dimensions for the new temple, the one that awaits. That's all given to him, and by the same. So David is in that unique category. But there would have been courtyards, outdoor spaces where people could congregate and gather, and there would have been rooms literally all around. So this was no building. This was a building with several buildings in it. So the monumentality of the task took him some 7 years to build it. He began it in the 4th year of his reign, and he inherited the throne when he was 19 years old. So he completes the task when he is 30. And for the divisions of the priest and the Levites, and all the works of the service of the house of Yahweh, and for all the vessels of service in the house of Yahweh. In the 23rd chapter, we read that establishes the narrative. You can pick up the 28th chapter where that left off. He privately addresses his son with advice in private company in the 22nd verse, but by the second verse of the 23rd, we read that the Levites were there. And then there's just this genealogical listing of the Levites and everyone else who's anybody in the 23rd through the 27th chapter. And the 27th chapter closes with the personnel, so we can read all about them in the 23rd chapter. They knew them by names. David took an active organizational interest in the liturgical worship services. He also composed psalms. So he was a priest and a king. He played a priestly function without being quite a priest. It would have been a house of service, a house of worship. We service him when we worship him, and then we go out into the world and continue the service there. That's the reason why we gather for worship. And there would have been several expensive vessels for the servant. He wouldn't have cheaped out for the vessels of gold and semi-precious stones that were in the house of Yahweh. Even gold by weight for utensils of gold, for all used in every kind of service, for silver for all utensils of silver, by weight for all utensils used in every kind of service. I believe we may have read the amount of gold in the 21st or 22nd chapter, but the point is that he spared no expense. This demanded a lot of gold. This was an expensive endeavor. So David did take the financial prerequisites, but Solomon ruled in greater wealth, and his wisdom is what enabled him to amass the wealth to do this all, according to the king's account. But every kind of service, silver, once more, a semi-precious commodity, a precious commodity with monetary value, all this would have been utilized and deployed in the service of the preparations, the foundations for the temple construction. Solomon would have to lay the first brick, but David did all he can to build it without actually building it and defying the express command. And by weight for the lampstand of gold, and their lamps of gold, by weight for each lampstand as it lamps, and for the lampstand of silver by weight, for the lampstand and its lamps according to the use of each lampstand. These lampstands would have demanded a massive amount of silver, else it wouldn't be mentioned in this account. So this is just an arrangement of the sacrifice. He spared no expense in the construction or preparation of the construction of this expensive endeavor. But Solomon may have financed it. This presents a conflicting picture between the King's account and the Chronicles one. Solomon's architect is a Tyrian architect who he procured via trade with King Hiram, who was younger than David and older than Solomon, and a friend and ally to both. And by weight, gold for the tables of the showbread, for each table, and silver for the table of silvers. All these things cost money. The tables of the showbread, that would have been the place where the priest would eat their showbread. It was specifically designed for the priest. They were the only ones who could eat it, but David, in his hour of maximum danger, and he and his friends who were on the run from Saul ate the bread on the showbread because they needed the nourishment and sustenance to move on. But this would have been expensive and no expense spared. And silver for more silver, silver for the tables of silver. And clean gold for the forks and the basins and the jars of clean gold and the golden bowls by weight for every bowl, and for the silver bowls, silver by weight for every bowl. The silver by weight would have been an exact measurement, proportioned in accordance to the bowl, the expenses of the bowl. And the forks, they wouldn't have been ordinary utensils, but gold forks. This was a sacred, solemn confines, and only the best would do. Jars of nothing but clean gold. Clean gold, we read that 2 times in that verse. That means gold that is refined of any impurity, that's really refined and fine and clean and pure. And refined gold by weight for the altar of incense, and for the pattern of the chariot, and the gold cherub, spreading out their wings and covering over the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. Refined gold, once more, would have been clean, synonymous with clean or pure. It would have been super fine, 24 carats, if not more. And this would have been elementary in the construction and integral to the structure of the altar of the incense. That is where incense was offered on an altar to accompany sacrifices. That was, in a sense, a sacrifice, a lifting up of something sweet smelling to divinity. And, the pattern of the chariot of the gold cherub. Cherubs are super angelic beings. We read of them in the vision of Ezekiel in the first chapter in the book which bears his name. And a cherub stood watch and guarded, preventing the re-entrance of Adam and Eve into the Garden of Eden after the fall. But the physical representation of an angel would have been present, and its wings would have covered over the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh. And this was not idolatry, because angels do have visible, tangible form. But Yahweh is invisible, ergo to represent him through physical or corporeal idols is a diminishment and a disgrace and a dishonoring of his true nature. Verse 19, Yahweh made me understand all this in writing by his hand upon me, all the works of these plans. So the same thing that happened to Moses when he was fasting for 40 days near Sinai in the 25th through 31st chapter of Exodus. That's when he received the revelation of all the ornate designs and intricacies of the temple. The tabernacle, the temple's predecessor. Nothing but the best. There was all this gold. And he had a similar architect, a man by the name of Oziel, I believe. And he was imparted by the Spirit with wisdom and skill. And Solomon certainly had those qualities as well. But the other occasion is Ezekiel. He receives the designs and dimensions of the new temple, the one that awaits in the 40th through 48th chapters of the book, which bears his name, or somewhere in between, certainly. But David claims the same inspiration. This is a revelation. This is not David's own designs and ideas, but imparted to him from divinity. And this may be an embellishment in light of the king's account, which the architectural credit is attributed to a Tyrrhenian architect whose name escapes me. And David said to his son Solomon, "Be strong and courageous, and do it. Do not fear nor be afraid, for Yahweh Elohim, my Elohim, is with you, and he shall not leave you nor forsake you until you have completed all the works of the service of the house of Yahweh." Fear can paralyze and immobilize us from doing what needs to be done. Fear is part of the fallen nature. It was a hitherto unexperienced emotion prior to Adam and Eve losing the covering of God, and they feared because they did wrong. So fear does function as a survival mechanism, and fear is alternately a rational response to a real danger or an irrational response to a perceived danger. Proverbs 28:1, the wicked flee when none pursue. So a coward is a sinner, and they are by design at the top of the list of those who are reserved for the lake of fire in Revelation 12:8. But fear, the antidote to fear is a fear of Yahweh, the Elohim. He is the fear which dispels all other lesser fears, because he puts it all in perspective. We will not fear those who have the power to harm our bodies and to end our lives if we fear the one who has the power to cast us in hell. So the fear of him is a faithful fear that puts all our unfaithful fears into focus and gives them perspective and meaning and depth. But you abide in him and he abides in you. But if you cease to abide in him, he will cease to abide in you. We are the branches, he is the vine, he is the sustenance for all our spiritual strength. And apart from him, so he has the promise that he will not forsake you until you have completed all the works. That he did at the tender age of 30 years old. That's when the building, set. Remember, we did the math earlier. 4th year of his reign, temple began. He inherited the throne when he was 19, and then so the 11 years later gives us the number of 30. And so much of Solomon's life after that point, once he completed that task, he really, by the end of his life, he certainly struggled with the meaning and purpose of everything, as recorded in the book of Ecclesiastes. But he did begin outstandingly, to his credit. "And see the divisions of the priest and the Levites for all the service of the house of Elohim, and every volunteer of any skill is with you in all work, for every kind of service, and the rulers in all the peoples are entirely at your command." The organizational patterns, who's who and who did what, there were rotating cycles, which in the priestly duties amongst the priests and the Levites were the tribe of priests, but not all priests were Levites, by this point at least. But, the service, there would have been rotating cycles. It would have been organized according to a wise design to fulfill the perpetual functions of service in the house of Elohim. And anyone of any skill, now every person does have at least one spiritual gift which can contribute to the collective. And if you don't know what that gift is, pray for it and get out in the trenches and figure it out through discovery. But every skill that would be needed for the completion of this architectural gem and wonder would have been with him and at his disposal. And every kind of good service. The purpose and the plan of the temple was to offer worthy service, or at least as worthy as we are can be humanly given, to the one whose worth is above and beyond ours. But all the rulers, all the secular, the power of the sword, everything else, all the people were his subjects and at his command and his disposal, and he had received them through the inheritance through David, who makes his declared succession abundantly clear in the Chronicles account. And remember, in the king's account, there is a vicious power struggle between Solomon and a rival claimant, the elder brother Adoniah, who seizes the throne premature to David's passing. He publicly declares himself, and he even persuades Joab, the most mighty military man, general in his army, to join his rebellion. But it is squashed when the attention to David is brought by him by the prophet David. And David did love to a fault, and he did not discipline at least the Absalom or Adoniah, and his laxity contributed to this ultimately. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.